Hey everyone, welcome back to History with Tim. Today we're diving into the final chapter in this pivotal history of Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916. We'll be reacting to Extra History's episode Death and Rebirth, which covers the dramatic final days of the Rising and the brutal aftermath that sparked a new wave of Irish nationalism. For those of you who may not know, the Easter Rising was more than just a rebellion. It was the heart and soul of a fight for freedom that reshaped Ireland's destiny. As someone with deep Irish roots, this story has always been close to my heart. The courage, the sacrifice, and the relentless spirit of the men and women who stood up against overwhelming odds. It's a story of tragedy, but also hope and rebirth. It is a reminder of why history matters, especially for those of us who feel a personal connection to it. But before we dive into that video, a quick note, this series isn't just about looking back, it's about keeping history alive. And that's why I encourage you to check out our National Park Preservation Fund, which helps support historic sites like the Kilmainham Gaol, where so many rising leaders spent their final days. If you enjoy this content and want to help preserve places where history happened, every little bit helps. Alright, let's get into Extra Histories, take on the Easter Rising, and don't forget, if you like what you see, hit the like button and subscribe and join our Patreon to keep our journey through history going. Now, let's see what the team over at Extra History got for us.
Kilmainham Gaol, Dublin, Ireland, May 3rd, 1916. It's so early in the morning, it's still dark outside. Patrick Pearse sits in his cell, quiet and contemplative, and he's just finished writing final letters to his mother and brother. A Roman Catholic priest is admitted by the guards, and Pearse bows his head to receive last rites. Shortly after, more soldiers arrive to escort him outside. He then marches to the end of the jail yard, a narrow space hemmed in by high, rough stone walls. He is then blindfolded, and a white marker tied around his chest. The execution detail lines up 12 steps away. Pearse faces them, and the orders ring out.
Now, there's different stories of how they actually did this. Generally, it's believed that they did it with this style, the white marker. They wrapped a white cloth around the leaders' chests so the soldiers knew where to aim. There was another story that what they did was they would take pieces of white paper and put it right on the heart, and that was the target. It was just different versions of the same thing. But yeah, this is exactly how it was handled. They just started doing firing squads on the leaders, and it was brutal.
Ready, aim, fire! In a nearby cell.
I've also been there. I've been where all of them got shot. It's haunting to imagine like that's the last thing you see before you die.
Patrick Pearse's younger brother William hears the echoing report of his brother's execution. In less than 24 hours, he will stand in the same spot and suffer the same fate.
Which I'll say was a little outrageous because Willie Pearse really wasn't. He was not a leader on any standards. He was a aide-de-camp as well. But unlike Michael Collins, Willie Pearse really didn't fight. Willie Pearse was with his brother pretty much taking his notes and writing messages for him. He wasn't fighting. So a lot of people think that was the British government's just... Well, it wasn't really even the British government, which we'll hopefully find out.
Thanks so much to HelloFresh for continuing to help us bring history to the table. In the aftermath of the Easter Rising, British authorities arrested thousands of Irish nationalists. Crowds of Dubliners jeered as some British soldiers led them off, calling them murderers for the bloodshed they'd brought into the city streets.
Now, there's so much that happened in the immediate aftermath before even the court-martial started. So what ends up happening is all of the prisoners are marched to barracks in the city to be like processed. Specifically Richmond Barracks, which is today Michael Collins Barracks. But what they did was pretty much anyone that was in the GPO as well as other areas, the Grand Post Office, and other areas like the Four Courts, St. Stephen's Green, and those general regions were brought to Richmond Barracks. They were lined up, and actually some of them were forced to strip naked. The British soldiers tried to humiliate them. Among those was Thomas Clark, one of the leaders. He was in his 80s. He was an older man, and they denigrated him in front of all of his people. And what ended up happening was the volunteers refused to look at him. But what you really have is this: the British wanted to punish them, but the other thing was the civilians were punishing them. People were throwing garbage at the volunteers as they were being transported to Richmond Barracks. People were trying to kill them. People were throwing punches. They were trying to stab. They were blaming them for their loved ones' deaths. They were calling them traitors and horrible things. Which, again, it's not... The biggest mistake in history is the people who think it's black and white. Because it's not. What they did could be... It was treason. It was. And, it's the same thing like the American Revolution. It was treason, but we won. So, it wasn't treason. But they lost, so they had to suffer the consequences.
Army courts tried a total of 187 nationalists in legal proceedings that broke a number of British laws. They were held in private, without allowing the accused any legal defense, and some of the military officers serving as judges had even fought against the rising. Due to the imposition of martial law, the British military commander in Ireland, General Sir John Maxwell, knew he'd be able to punish the rebels with impunity. He was assisted in this by General Charles Blackadder, and both men were determined to punish the nationalists as swiftly as possible, regardless of public opinion or even the will of the government.
And that's what I mean. Maxwell declared military rule. This meant the civilian population, the viceroy, the governor general, the first minute. Nope. Don't care what you have to say. I'm in charge. I am in military control of this country. I will kill 1,000 people if I have to. This is Maxwell's mentality. He's like, I am going to put justice and order back in. Enough is enough. And he blames people like the viceroy and the governor general. He says, you had the chance to stop this, but you were waiting for them to do something, and now look all the dead and the damage. And the thing was, his mentality was, if I am as brutal as I can be, and this is a very old British tactic. If I am as brutal as I can be, they won't do it again. Let's see how that backfires on them.
Of the 187 men tried, 90 were sentenced to death, 75 of which eventually had their sentences commuted, but 14 suffered the ultimate punishment, with firing squads conducting the grim work in the yard of Kilmainham Gaol. Patrick Pearse was shot on the first day of the executions. 2 other nationalists died within minutes of him, and 4 others, including William Pearse, were shot the day after. And for 5 days, between May 3rd and May 12th, the rifles boomed, with each of the rebels facing death without flinching. Now, Maxwell claimed that only the ringleaders of the rising and those who had killed in cold blood were executed.
Which that was a complete lie. As I said before, Willie Pearse had nothing. Willie Pearse was an aide-de-camp. As I said before, he did not actually fight. He didn't. I don't believe there's any record of him actually holding a gun up at anyone during the rising. Maxwell, this was retribution. Maxwell might have said it was justice, but it was retribution. He wanted payback for what had happened. He was perfectly okay, even shooting people like Countess Maudiewicz. Like, he was good with it. He was like, whatever gets the message across. But the issue is, the public didn't like that. Not even just the English public, the Irish public, and the foreign publics. The American public thought this was barbaric. They thought it was insane that England was talking about virtue and everything, and how the Germans were so backwards, but then they're executing people by firing squad. And this will actually culminate in the execution of James Connolly. I don't know if they're going to talk about that, but let's keep watching and see.
But that wasn't entirely true. William Pearse, for example, had only worked as his brother's aide, had not been...
I didn't watch this. I just want you to know that. I didn't know they were going to bring that up.
...involved in planning or leading the rebellion, nor had he killed anyone. Nevertheless, he suffered his brother's fate. As the executions continued, the public's mood began to markedly change. Apathy toward the rising was replaced by dismay at the military's actions, both in suppressing the revolt and the clearly unfair trials. Stoked by international pressure and members of the press sympathetic to the nationalist cause, this unrest quickly swelled into a fury. While most of Ireland hadn't wished to take up armed struggle, there was still widespread sympathy for the nationalist cause, and this rapidly translated into sympathy for these failed rebels. On the other side of things, the British government was similarly concerned with General Maxwell's handling of the affair, because it was feared that as they killed the rebels one by one, the leaders of this rising were being transmuted into martyrs.
And that's exactly what happened. Maxwell thought he could bury them. And literally, he did a terrible thing with their bodies. He had their bodies put in lye and chemicals, and they were actually disintegrated to the point that you couldn't even be able to figure out who was who. And he threw them in a mass grave at Arbor Hill, where they still rest today, except now there is a appropriate grave marker for the 17 executed. But all they did was deify the leaders, which is the last thing they wanted to do. They deified them, and they made them into these heroes, these symbols of freedom. And, someone like James Connolly, he was the working class's hero. My father was a police officer, but there's a song from Blarney Stone that the band Black 47 adapted called James Connolly. And it's about union workers and everything. And my father, he was in the police union, but he loved that song because the thing was, regardless of what you thought about Connolly stood up for the little guy. And that's something that everyone knew. If you were like the widow of a factory worker or something, James Connolly would go and help you personally. He would get in the face of Dublin detectives and tell them to back off. And that was why when people found out how he was executed, that's when they had enough.
Meaning in death, the rebellion and its leaders were achieving what they'd failed to do in life, rousing Ireland to rebellion. By May 12th, even Unionist Irish politicians were calling for the executions to stop. On that day, James Connolly faced the firing squad, the 14th Nationalist to do so. And, due to public pressure, he would be the last, at least for the time being. But as the echoes of...
So the reason James Connolly's will be the last and would be the one that caused the most outcry. So last video I explained during the surrender, Connolly got shot. He was shot in the leg and it had gone gangrenous. He was the only leader that was not actually held in Kilmainham. He was held actually at Dublin Castle. They actually have the suite he was held in still up. The reason he wasn't held in Kilmainham was because of how infected his leg had gotten. He was going to die, period. There was no scenario, even if Maxwell did not find him guilty, he was going to die. It had gone gangrenous, it had gone into his bloodstream. He was actually delirious at the end. But he couldn't stand. So what they did with him was they had an ambulance bring him in from Dublin Castle to Kilmainham, and he is the only leader that was not executed on the same area. Now, the reason all the other leaders were shot on the far side of the yard away from the door, because obviously, one, it kind of muzzles the noise a little bit, even though it's still an open air area. At least it's not near the street, so there's not a chance also it could get into the street. But also, it's just easy because that's where the door was for the prison, where you would come out and you just put them there. Connolly, they brought him in an ambulance, and they had a chair near the street side of the yard. They got him out, they tied him to the chair, which again, the guy wasn't going to run. The guy didn't know what was going on. He was delirious, he was dying. It was actually, and some historians say this, and I agree with this assessment, it was a mercy killing for Connolly, at least, because he was going to die. He was either going to die a painful death from gangrene, or he could have just got shot and lights out. But people walking by Kilmainham, because Kilmainham is in the heart of Dublin, it's only like 7 blocks from the Liffey River on the southwest side of the city. So people are walking by and they're seeing James Connolly. This guy, you know, James Connolly helped out your mom. He got her the pension she needed. James Connolly, he's the one that sent those workers to fix your boiler. They're seeing this guy that they all loved get carried in on a stretcher, the doors get closed, and unlike the other guys, maybe 15, 20 seconds go by and they hear a volley and they know what that means. This is the one that makes everyone go, like, they get furious because they're like, this is insane. Why are they doing? They're like, he was going to die anyway. What was the point of shooting them? Which, again, you know, in my opinion, I think it was a mercy killing, but also at the same time, Maxwell was trying to make an example, but that example backfired.
Of that final rifle volley faded within Kilmainham's stone walls, the silence left suggested not an ending, but a new beginning. In August, the diplomat Roger Casement was also sentenced to death. Despite not having taken up arms himself in the Rising, his work procuring weapons and recruits in America and Germany saw him convicted of treason. Oddly enough, an obscure legal loophole relating to the placement of a specific comma in a statute was used to ensure a death sentence, to which Casement commented wryly that he was to be hanged on a comma. He was executed August 3rd. In the aftermath of these executions, one group,
and pretty terribly, he had requested to be buried in Ireland, and the British government refused it. They just buried him in the prison yard. Good Samaritan down the road, though, would have his body moved back to Ireland, where he rests today.
Quickly moved to harness this general sense of anger and injustice and tie it to specific political goals. The Sinn Féin party had been founded in 1905 as a moderate nationalist party. Originally, they'd advocated for an Ireland that was independent from Great Britain, but that also remained part of the British Empire, retaining the monarchy. But by 1916, both the attitude and goals of the party had changed. Many members of the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Republican Brotherhood were also members of Sinn Féin, and the party was seen, wrongly to an extent, as the driving force behind militant republicanism. So Sinn Féin chose to capitalize on this misconception, and in 1917, they pivoted to an avowedly Republican stance, a move for which they were awarded with victory of 73 out of Ireland's 105 parliamentary seats in the 1918 general election. And for some, the victory of a Republican Party was a green light to take up arms once again. Near Ballyvorney, Ireland, July 7th, 1918. Sunlight dapples the Irish countryside as two policemen of the Royal Irish Constabulary walk along a quiet lane. They've just left the village of Ballyvorney, having attempted to stop an illegal gathering. But as they pass through the mouth of the glen, gunshots ring out. Several figures leap from the surrounding hedgerows and assail the two policemen. One is shot in the neck, the other is thrown into the dirt and beaten. His attackers identify themselves as Irish volunteers. The Nationalists take the carbines and ammunition carried by the police and leave them in the roadway. And this is only the beginning.
This was something, too, that, you know, if you were a member of the RIC, they saw you as a traitor. They didn't like you. They saw you are swearing an oath to a foreign monarch, pretty much, to them. And the general election, that was for the Dáil Nahéireann, which is actually still what the Irish legislature is called to this day. And as I said, Sinn Féin, I said this in a previous video, Sinn Féin, you know, they were a moderate party at the beginning because they had both working class socialists as well as moderate middle class all working together for the same aims. But when the Irish Civil War breaks out, they're going to split, and the leftists are going to side with the IRA, whereas the moderates are going to side with the Free State.
For the Easter Rising may be in the past, but after the executions and the rise of Sinn Féin, the nationalist cause has never been stronger. That ambush was the first time the nationalists had fired on the police since the end of the Rising, and it signaled further violence ahead. Buoyed by election success, Sinn Féin and its adherents prepared for an armed uprising that would eclipse that of 1916. In early 1919, an uprising that became known as the Irish War of Independence flared throughout Ireland. Nationalists waged a guerrilla campaign, resulting in around 2,300 dead, nearly half of them civilians. But despite the British government responding with aggressive tactics, it soon became clear that this time, Ireland would have to be granted its independence.
Interesting fact about that, one of a young officer in the Irish War of Independence for the British was one Sir Bernard Montgomery, Monty got his start in Ireland. He actually was a big proponent of the tactics used by the Black and Tans, the paramilitary organization that the British government set loose on Ireland. It's things like this that backfired on the English, though. More violent they got, the more violent the Irish got. One of the many bloody Sundays in Irish history will be when Michael Collins and his 12 apostles, what his 12 apostles were 12 hitmen who weren't married, they didn't have families, and they were loyal to Collins. He sent them out to kill British detectives known as the Cairo Gang. And after he killed them, the British retaliated by shooting up Croke Park, which still exists today. It's much bigger now today, but it was a massacre at Croke Park, and it became known as Bloody Sunday.
Though less than a year later, a second war was raging, this one a civil war among Irish nationalists. One faction consisted of Republicans, while the other comprised those who wanted Ireland to remain part of the British Empire, even though by then it was no longer part of the United Kingdom. And after a year of fighting that proved just as...
That's a misconception. That's not exactly what it was. It wasn't they wanted to stay part of the British Empire. It was that was the best deal they could get. The IRA and Free State forces were split down the middle because the IRA wanted total and unequivocal freedom and the North. The Free State was, we have been fighting this war for nearly 700 years. This deal is at least the first stepstone to independence. Let's just sign it. I think, and I love extra history, I think that's a very unfair characterization of the Free Staters. It's not that they wanted to stay in the British Empire. It was that they were just exhausted. The Irish War of Independence, I'll do videos on that too. And I do actually have a video on the Irish War of Independence. It was brutal. It was a brutal war. It was honestly kind of like a gangster war. It was, you put mine in the hospital, I put yours in the morgue. That's what it was, and the people of Ireland were exhausted, and that is why they overwhelmingly voted in favor of the Free State.
As bloody as the War of Independence, the Republicans were defeated and the Irish Free State born. In the aftermath of all of that conflict, the Easter Rising itself remains difficult to categorize. To some, it was nothing less than the realization of centuries of struggle against imperial domination, often rhetorically intertwined with the Roman Catholic symbolism of Easter. It's seen as a righteous rebellion by brave men.
So he's just going to be doing a closing here because this is usually where his videos end anyway. But I'm gonna say that this all's been great. I just think that's a very unfair characterization of the Free State faction. It wasn't that they didn't want freedom. They wanted freedom. It's just they were exhausted of it being out. You know, there's a famous quote about Michael Collins. Michael Collins will be killed during the Irish Civil War, which is also a point of contention to a lot of people. But Michael Collins, a lot of people say he died finally trying to take the gun out of Irish politics. And that's what the Free State Treaty was. It was to try to end the war. Because that was the thing. You know, a young Winston Churchill was working in the British government at that time, and he threatened a horrible war if they did not accept the terms. But with that said, that is Extra History series on the Easter Rising. I'm kind of happy that it covered the War of Independence and went to the Civil War, because I'm going to do our next two videos are going to be on the Irish Civil War. But with that said, thank you so much everyone for joining me. I hope you enjoy this. If you guys like this kind of content, let me know. I like I said, I like doing Extra History. Our next video, I'm going to be using Simon over at War Graphics. But thank you so much for joining me today. Please, if you're able to, donate to our History of Tim's National Park Preservation Fund. Every bit helps. And also, if you're a fan, please join our Patreon. We got that 5-tier, private, sergeant, captain, colonel, and marshal. And please like, share, and comment. And if you're new to the channel or you're returning, please hit the red button, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay up to date with all of our content. Thank you so much for joining us today, friends. I hope you enjoyed this little piece of Irish history, and I will see you in the next one.